Okay, how you doing? I'm Kenny Joya. Welcome to another one of my tutorials. In this video, I want to show you how to use EQ in REAPER. Mainly using the EQ that comes with REAPER, ReaEQ. Now, although I'm doing this in REAPER and I'm using this specific plugin, most EQs work the same way. So much of this can really be applied to anything you're using. I just happen to prefer this one as it works great for me. And it's free, as it comes with REAPER. So what we're going to do is go through the most common sources I use EQ on. It's not every source, but it's the most important ones for me. And I'm going to show you how I generally use EQ on these sources. But please keep in mind that this is a general overview. It's not how I always do it, and it does depend on the source. But I will say for the most part, this is how I use EQ on these common sources. So let's jump in. So let's start off with a kick drum. A kick drum recorded with a multi-mic'd kit. Let's see what we have now. Let's hear it with some EQ. Now typically, I'm not going to put a high pass on a kick drum because I want as much low end as possible. So I'll start off with a low end shelving right here and see if we could use some more low end. Make it sound deeper. And by using a shelving EQ, it's a lot wider sounding, so it sounds very natural as it boosts from the frequency, right here, all the way down, as opposed to a parametric EQ, which focuses on just this spot, like this one. Somewhere between 100 and 180 hertz is a good place to start. It makes it sound deeper. Now, another trick to making it sound deeper is to cut some lower mids using a parametric, like this one here, and watch how much deeper it sounds. Now, you don't want to go too far and kill all that range, but pulling it down a bit makes the kick sound bigger, as there's more energy in the low end and the top end. Somewhere around 450 hertz sounds pretty good for this. Now, I don't always do this part. It depends on the song and the style of music, but if you want more click to the kick, use a parametric EQ in the mid to upper mid range. And again, this depends on the style of song. Metal or heavy rock songs want a bit more click, while most other styles don't need as much. Bypass it, and back in. That sounds a lot better to me. Let's move on to the snare. This is the top mic of a snare kit. Let's hear what it sounds like. Now let's add some EQ to it. Now typically, I don't roll off any low end, but you could if it sounds muddy. but I think this one's fine. Let's start with the top end and add a parametric EQ to give it some attack, or some bite, or some crack. Now typically, I use a parametric EQ, but sometimes you can add a high shelving EQ to make it sound brighter and prettier, which is going to boost from this frequency all the way up. Let's hear the difference. Now this brings up the cymbals, so you have to be careful of that, but we could also blend a parametric and the shelving to get the right sound. Something like that feels pretty good. Now if we move to the low end, using a lower mid-range parametric EQ, we could boost the meat, or the body or punch of the snare. Somewhere around 300 to 350 hertz sounds pretty good on this. Let's hear before and after. Now if we mix this with the bottom snare, we can get even more top end, or more crispness to the sound. Let's hear the bottom snare mic. We'll roll off any low end, because we don't really need that. And use a high frequency shelving to bring up the brightness, or bring out the snares. And we can blend the bottom snare mic with the top mic to get a nice blend of both mics. Before and after. That sounds a lot better to me. Now let's move on to the overheads. Now for the overheads, I typically want to make them sound as pretty as possible. Really bring up the top end to get the brightness or the excitement of the kit. Let's hear what it sounds like now. Let's add some EQ. And we'll start off with a high shelving EQ. That's about 6 kilohertz, and it's shelving, so it goes all the way up, from 6 kilohertz up to 20 kilohertz. Now some guys like to roll off the low end with a high pass, to get more of the cymbals and less of the kit, but I don't prefer to do it that way. I prefer to leave it all in there and just bring out the top end, but still keep the body in the overheads. Now let's hear all the drums together. Now before EQ and after EQ. That sounds a lot better to me. Let's move on to the bass guitar. Let's hear what the bass guitar sounds like with no EQ. Now let's add some EQ to it. And like with the kick drum, we're going to start off with a low frequency shelving. About 150 Hertz feels pretty good. And remember, it's from there all the way down. Now, if you want to bring out the top end or the finger noise, we could add some upper mid-range using a parametric EQ. Before, it sounds a bit anemic. After, it sounds much deeper, but also clearer. Let's move on to the piano. Let's hear what the piano sounds like. Let's add some EQ. Now, typically, I don't filter out any low end on piano. It doesn't usually go too deep. Unless I want to create an effect. We could bring up some meat with a parametric. Or if it's too deep, we could cut some of that out. Now with piano, sometimes you can use a high shelving to make it sound prettier. But most times, it works better and cuts better with a parametric EQ in the upper mids. Before and after. It just cuts a bit better. Let's check out acoustic guitar. Now with acoustic guitar, the first range I go for is the low end. If it sounds too boomy, I like to filter that out. Let's hear what it sounds like. Somewhere around 100 usually does the trick. But if it still sounds boomy, I'll use a parametric to cut out some low mid-range. And finally, I'll use a high shelving to make it sound pretty. Now, if we use a parametric for this, it tends to sound very thin and nasally. So I prefer a shelving. It also brings out the percussiveness in the sound. Before and after. That sounds a lot better to me. Let's check out the electric guitars. Now for the electric guitars, there's two of them. So I put them on a folder so I can EQ them together. Right here. Let's hear what they sound like now. Now these guitar sounds came from amp sims. So a lot of times with amp sims or plugins, they have more low end than an amp can produce. So the first thing I go for is a high pass filter to get rid of any low end rumble and make room for the bass guitar. Around 75 Hertz will be enough. Now if they still sound muddy, I'll use a parametric EQ to bring down the lower mid-range. And finally, to give it some bite, I'll use a parametric EQ for the upper mid-range. Now I'd never use a shelving for this because it makes the guitar sound too bright. Let's hear that. That's a bit too shrill for me, so I'll use a parametric EQ instead. Before and after. That'll cut to the track quite nicely. And finally, let's use some EQ on vocals. Let's see what we have now.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start.
Let's add it. And again, the first thing I want to check out is a high pass to get rid of any low-end rumble.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start.
About 80 is pretty good. Now if it's too chesty or too thick, we can cut some low mid-range with a parametric EQ.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start.
Now if it's too thin, we would boost that range.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start. You kept me close, you had me tied to the strings, now you're watching it all fall apart.
Now the next range is a high frequency shelving EQ to make the vocal sound brighter and prettier.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start. You kept me close, you had me tied to the strings, now you're watching it all fall apart.
About 5 kilohertz works for this. Now we could also use a parametric EQ to bring out the upper mids, but that tends to sound a bit nasal.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start.
So usually, I'll use a high shelving.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start.
Before
you had me going, I believed everything.
And after.
You had me going, I believed everything, every word that you said from the start. You kept me close, you had me tied to the strings, now you're watching it all fall apart.
So anyway, that's using EQ in REAPER using the ReaEQ plugin. And again, a lot of the settings I'm showing you here will work with just about any EQ plugin, not just REAPER's, but this is how I do it with this one. So anyway, that's using EQ on the most common sources for me. I hope you learned something. I hope you can use it. and I'll see you next time. Thanks.